The storm had turned the city into chaos. Rain fell like shattered glass, crashing against car roofs and flooding the sidewalks. The sky was bruised and grey, and thunder rolled across it like a warning from heaven. People hurried under umbrellas, clutching their coats, running to escape the cold wind that cut through the night. But in the middle of the street, drenched, trembling, and alone, stood a small boy. No umbrella, no jacket, just a pair of soaked shoes and a crumpled photograph clutched tightly in his tiny hands. His face was pale, his lips blue from the chill, and his eyes, wide and terrified, searched every stranger that passed by. He tried to speak, but his voice came out in sobs. "Ma'am, someone please help my dad," he cried, but no one stopped. Cars splashed dirty water over his legs as they sped past. People looked away, pretending not to hear. The city moved on, heartless and cold, as if the boy's cries were part of the rain itself. Then, from across the street, a woman turned. She was carrying a paper grocery bag that was already soaked through. Her umbrella had flipped inside out, and she looked exhausted, her dark skin glistening with raindrops, her uniform clinging to her arms. Her name was Grace Miller, a nurse's assistant at St. Mary's Hospital. She had just finished a 12-hour shift and was on her way home to her small apartment in the Bronx, where her son was waiting for dinner. But when she heard that desperate voice, that trembling plea, and she froze. Her eyes locked onto the boy standing in the rain. Something deep in her heart stirred. She didn't think, and she just ran. "Hey! Hey, sweetie," she called out, dodging puddles. "What's wrong? Where's your mom or dad?" The boy looked up, tears mixing with rain on his cheeks. "My dad, he's not breathing." "Please help him." Grace's heart lurched. She dropped her ruined umbrella and crouched down so she was eye level with him. The boy couldn't have been more than 8 years old, his little hands shaking as he held out the photo. It was a picture of a man in a suit, smiling proudly with his arm around the same boy. "Where is he?" she asked urgently. The boy pointed down the street. "At home, please hurry, he fell down, he's not waking up." Without another word, Grace grabbed the boy's hand. "Take me there," she said firmly. "Right now." The boy nodded frantically and started running, splashing through puddles with Grace keeping pace beside him. Her grocery bag fell somewhere behind her, forgotten. The only thing that mattered now was that man, and the terrified little boy trying to save him. They turned corner after corner, running past glowing streetlights and closed shops. The rain grew heavier, blurring everything into streaks of silver and shadow. Grace's shoes squelched with each step, but she didn't care. Her mind raced with medical possibilities: cardiac arrest, stroke, heart failure. "Please, God," she whispered under her breath, "let me get there in time." Finally, they stopped. The boy pointed at a tall black gate at the end of a quiet lane. Beyond it stood a massive mansion, its windows glowing faintly in the storm. Grace blinked in disbelief. The building looked like something out of a magazine. Marble pillars, glass walls, and gardens big enough for a park. "This is your home?" she asked, stunned. The boy nodded through his tears. "Yes, my dad's inside. No one's helping him." Grace didn't have time to question why. She pushed open the gate, which creaked loudly, and followed him up the long driveway. The front door was unlocked, strange for such a grand place, and as soon as they stepped inside, the world went silent. The mansion was beautiful, but eerily empty. The sound of the rain faded behind them, replaced by the faint hum of a chandelier swaying overhead. Then Grace saw him. A man, lying on the floor near the staircase, his skin pale, his hand clutching his chest. His eyes were half open, gasping for air that wouldn't come. "Dad!" the boy screamed, running to him. Grace's instincts kicked in. She rushed forward, kneeling beside the man. "Sir, can you hear me?" she said loudly. No response. She placed 2 fingers on his neck, and faint pulse. Barely there. She looked at the boy. "What's your name, honey?" "Ethan," he sobbed. "Please save my daddy." Grace's heart ached. She took his small hand, squeezing it tightly. "Ethan, listen to me. I need you to stay calm. We're going to help him, okay? But I need you to be brave." The boy nodded through his tears. Grace took a deep breath, grabbed her phone and dialed emergency services, shouting into the receiver as she began CPR with steady, practiced hands. "Stay with me, sir." "Please," she whispered as thunder crashed outside. The mansion, once filled with wealth and silence, now echoed with the sound of hope, faith, and a stranger's courage in the storm. And in that moment, Grace Miller, a poor, tired nurse, became the only lifeline between a billionaire and death itself. Grace and little Ethan rushed through the towering black gates as lightning illuminated the sky. The boy's small hand trembled in hers as they ran up the long marble path, their shoes splashing in puddles that had formed on the driveway. The mansion loomed above them, grand, elegant, and eerily silent. Grace had never seen anything like it. Massive stone lions guarded the entrance. Golden lights flickered faintly from crystal chandeliers beyond the tall glass doors. But despite its beauty, the place felt hollow, like a palace abandoned by warmth. Ethan pushed open the heavy door with both hands, crying, "Dad, we're here. Please wake up." The sound of his voice echoed through the grand hall, bouncing off the marble floors and high ceilings. Grace followed him inside and froze. The air smelled faintly of expensive cologne and panic, that strange mix of fear and stillness that fills a home when something terrible has happened. The floor beneath her feet was spotless white marble, and above a massive chandelier hung like frozen lightning, its crystal drops glimmering even in the storm's shadow. Then she saw him. A man, tall, well-built, probably in his early 40s, lay on the floor near a velvet couch. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, one hand clutching his chest, his face twisted in pain. His lips were pale and beads of sweat rolled down his forehead. "Daddy!" Ethan dropped to his knees beside him. "Please don't leave me." Grace's heart clenched. She hurried forward and knelt beside the man, checking for a pulse. It was faint. His breaths were shallow, quick gasps that grew weaker with each passing second. "Sir, can you hear me?" she said, tapping his cheek lightly. No response. Her nursing instincts took over completely. She grabbed a nearby pillow and slid it gently under his head, loosening his tie and the top buttons of his shirt. "Ethan, listen carefully," she said firmly but kindly. "Call 911. Tell them your dad isn't breathing properly and you need an ambulance right now." Ethan fumbled for a phone that had fallen beside the couch, his little fingers shaking so much he could barely press the buttons. Grace helped him quickly, speaking into the phone herself. "Yes, cardiac arrest suspected. Middle-aged male. Address?" She looked around the luxurious room, completely unsure where she even was. "We're at 94 Eastbrook Avenue." "Please hurry. He's fading fast." The operator promised an ambulance was on the way, but Grace knew time was running out. She tilted the man's head slightly and began chest compressions, strong, rhythmic, steady, counting under her breath. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Her palms pressed down firmly against his chest. Every few compressions she checked his pulse again. Nothing. "Come on, sir," she whispered desperately. "Don't give up now, breathe." Ethan knelt beside her, crying uncontrollably. "Is he gonna die?" Grace looked at him, his small face soaked in tears, and her heart broke. "Not if I can help it," she said. She kept pressing, her arms aching, her knees slipping on the marble floor. Rain pounded against the windows, lightning flashing over the chandelier. For a moment it felt like heaven itself was holding its breath. Then suddenly, at a faint sound, a weak gasp escaped the man's lips. His fingers twitched. Grace leaned closer. "That's it, come on. Stay with me." Ethan grabbed his father's hand, sobbing, "Daddy, I'm here!" The man's eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused and full of pain. "Ethan," he whispered faintly. Grace felt tears sting her own eyes. "You're okay, sir. Just keep breathing. Help is coming." Moments later, she heard the distant wail of sirens. Relief flooded her body. She looked down at her trembling hands, slick with rain and sweat, and exhaled shakily. She had done everything she could. The front door burst open and paramedics rushed in, bright uniforms, stretchers, and oxygen tanks. One of them looked at Grace in surprise. "You performed CPR?" She nodded breathlessly. "Yes, about 10 minutes. He's got a pulse now, but it's weak." The medic looked at her in awe. "You may have just saved his life." As they lifted the man onto a stretcher, Ethan refused to let go of his father's hand until Grace gently pried his fingers loose. "They'll take care of him now, sweetheart," she said softly. "You did amazing. You found help just in time." The boy looked up at her with red, puffy eyes. "Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for coming." Grace brushed the wet hair off his forehead. You're a brave boy, Ethan. You saved your dad by not giving up. As the paramedics carried the stretcher outside, Grace followed them to the door. For a brief moment, she looked back into the mansion, grand, cold, and silent once again. The echoes of Ethan's cries still lingered in the air. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering, and whispered, "I hope he makes it." The storm was still raging outside, but inside her heart, something had changed. She had walked into a world that didn't belong to her, a world of money and marble. Yet in that moment, her compassion had become more valuable than all the wealth in that house. And as she stepped into the rain once more, the flashing ambulance lights painted the night sky red and blue, a symbol of life, of hope, and of one stranger's courage to care. The ambulance was taking too long. Grace could hear the dispatcher's voice still echoing in her mind. "Stay calm. Help is on the way." But she knew those words were no comfort when seconds could mean the difference between life and death. Ethan's father, still unconscious, was barely breathing. His chest rose and fell in weak, uneven gasps. His face had gone grey, and the pulse Grace had felt earlier was now dangerously faint. "Come on, sir," she whispered, pressing 2 fingers against his neck again. "Don't leave your boy." Outside, thunder cracked like the sky itself was breaking apart. Rain splattered against the mansion windows in furious rhythm, each drop sounding like a ticking clock, counting down the moments left. Grace's hands shook, but she pushed her fear down deep. She had faced chaos before in hospital hallways and emergency rooms, but never like this. Never alone. Never with a terrified child watching every move she made. "Ma'am, is he going to be okay?" Ethan asked, his small voice trembling. Grace looked at him, his clothes soaked, his cheeks streaked with tears, and forced a steady tone. "We're not giving up, okay? But I need your help. Go to the kitchen and bring me a big towel, hurry." The boy sprinted off, his little footsteps echoing down the marble hall. Grace took off her soaked jacket and used it to cover the man's chest to keep him warm. She leaned down, checking his airway, tilting his head back slightly, then pinched his nose. "Breathe for me," she said softly. Before giving 2 firm rescue breaths, his chest barely moved. She started compressions again, her palms stacked, arms locked, pushing with the rhythm she knew by heart. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Her breaths came faster, matching the tempo of her heartbeat. When Ethan returned, clutching a towel that was almost too big for him to carry, Grace quickly wiped the man's mouth and forehead. "Good job," she said gently. "Stay right here. Talk to him. Keep his spirit fighting." The boy knelt beside his father. His small hands trembled as he touched the man's shoulder. "Daddy, please wake up. I need you. I can't lose you." Grace felt a lump rise in her throat. She'd seen pain before, but something about this boy's voice, so full of love, so desperate, cut straight through her heart. She pressed harder. "Come on, breathe. Please breathe." A faint cough. Then silence. She checked again, still no strong pulse. Panic clawed at her chest. "No, no, no, no," she whispered, tears threatening to fall. "You're not dying tonight. Not while your boy's standing here praying for you." Her arms burned, her body aching, but she refused to stop. She'd promised Ethan, and she wouldn't break that promise. "Please, God," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Please give me strength." She pressed again, harder. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then suddenly a sharp gasp. The man's body jolted beneath her hands. Grace froze, eyes wide. "That's it. That's it. Come on." She quickly turned his head to the side as he coughed weakly, air finally finding its way into his lungs. Ethan gasped. "Daddy, he moved!" Grace exhaled shakily, her heart pounding. "That's it, sir. You're okay. Stay with me." She kept checking his pulse, still weak but stronger than before. Color slowly crept back into his face. The sound of distant sirens finally reached the driveway. Relief washed over Grace like warm light after a long night. She sat back for a second, catching her breath, her wet hair clinging to her face. Ethan wrapped his small arms around her neck without warning. "You saved him. You saved my daddy," he sobbed. Grace hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her face now too. "You helped save him, Ethan. You never gave up. That's what love does." Moments later, paramedics burst through the mansion doors, carrying medical gear and oxygen tanks. A tall medic rushed to Grace's side. "What's the situation?" Middle-aged male, cardiac arrest. I performed CPR for about 12 minutes. He's got a pulse now, shallow but present, she explained quickly, her voice hoarse. The medic looked impressed. You're trained? Grace nodded faintly. Nurse's assistant, St. Mary's Hospital. Good work, he said sincerely as his team took over. You probably saved his life. Grace moved aside, exhaustion hitting her like a wave. She leaned against the wall, watching as they worked, attaching oxygen, checking vitals, lifting him onto a stretcher. Ethan wouldn't leave his father's side, holding his hand as the paramedics carried him out through the rain. Grace followed slowly behind, her legs weak but her spirit strong. The night air hit her face cold and sharp. The flashing red and blue lights of the ambulance lit up the wet driveway. The sound of the rain seemed softer now, as if the storm itself was sighing in relief. As they closed the ambulance doors, Ethan turned to her. Will you come with us? Grace hesitated, her eyes full of compassion. Of course, sweetheart. I'll stay until I know he's safe. And as the ambulance sped away into the night, Grace sat beside Ethan, holding his hand while the city lights blurred past. She didn't know who that man was. She didn't know his wealth, his name, or his story. But she knew one thing for sure. She had saved more than just a life tonight. She had saved a little boy's world. The flashing red and blue lights of the ambulance cut through the storm as it raced through the city. Inside, the air was tense, the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor, the smell of antiseptic, and the faint wheeze of oxygen. Grace sat on the narrow bench beside the stretcher, her soaked hair plastered to her face. Her hands trembled, but she kept them pressed over the patient's, Ethan's father's, cold fingers, whispering quietly. Stay with me, sir. You've got a little boy who needs you. Ethan sat across from her, his small body wrapped in a medic's jacket, shivering but holding his father's hand tightly. His tear-streaked face was full of hope and fear all at once. Ma'am, he's going to be okay, right? He asked, his voice cracking. Grace forced a smile through her exhaustion. He's a fighter, Ethan, so are you. We're not giving up. When the ambulance finally stopped at St. Matthew's private hospital, the doors burst open and a team of doctors rushed out. They wheeled the man inside, attaching IV lines and checking vitals. Grace followed close behind, ignoring the nurses who told her to stay back. Inside the brightly lit emergency room, the storm outside felt miles away. Machines beeped, gloves snapped, and doctors shouted commands. Patient male 42 cardiac arrest. CPR performed for 12 minutes by a civilian rescuer. Pulse regained. Shallow breathing stabilized, one paramedic reported. Grace stood quietly in the corner, soaked and pale, watching every movement with anxious eyes. After what felt like forever, a doctor finally turned to her. Are you family? Grace hesitated. No, I'm not. I was just... She saved him, Ethan interrupted loudly. She helped my dad when nobody else did. The doctor's eyes softened. He nodded respectfully. Well, whoever you are, ma'am, you saved this man's life. He's alive because of you. Grace felt her knees weaken with relief. She leaned against the wall, tears mixing with the rain still dripping from her hair. Thank you, God, she whispered. But just as calm began to settle, the sound of heels clicking sharply against the hospital floor cut through the air. Everyone turned. A tall, elegant woman entered, dressed in a long fur coat despite the rain, diamonds glittering at her ears, her makeup perfect even under the harsh hospital lights. Her face was beautiful, but her eyes were ice. Where is he? She demanded. Where is my husband? The doctors parted, bowing slightly. Mrs. Hargrove, your husband is stable for now. He's being moved to intensive care. Grace froze. Hargrove. That was the name from the business magazines. Richard Hargrove, the billionaire real estate magnate who built half the city. The man she'd just saved was him. The woman's eyes swept across the room until they landed on Ethan. Ethan, baby. Oh, thank God you're safe, she exclaimed, kneeling to embrace him. But Ethan hesitated, glancing nervously toward Grace, before stepping into his mother's arms. Mom, he said softly. This lady helped Dad. She saved him. The woman straightened slowly, her cold gaze shifting toward Grace. You? Grace stood awkwardly, clutching the strap of her worn-out bag. Yes, ma'am, I found your son in the rain. He said his father needed help. I performed CPR until the ambulance came. For a long moment, the woman said nothing. Her eyes moved from Grace's soaked shoes to her faded jacket, then to her tired, humble face. The air around her seemed to grow colder. Helped? The woman finally said, her voice sharp as glass. Or were you looking for an opportunity to sneak into my home? Grace blinked in shock. Excuse me? The woman stepped closer, her perfume filling the air like poison. I know your type. You people always find a way to take advantage, pretending to be heroes, hoping for money or sympathy. The words hit like a slap. Grace's mouth opened, but no sound came. Ethan gasped, pulling on his mother's sleeve. Mom, stop! She really did save him. I saw it. She helped Dad breathe again. But the woman ignored him, her gaze still fixed on Grace with disgust. You should leave. My husband doesn't need strangers hovering around him. Mrs. Hargrove, a nurse protested gently. She's the reason your husband survived the cardiac arrest. But Mrs. Hargrove turned sharply. I said leave. Two hospital security guards stepped forward uncertainly, glancing between the women. Grace felt her chest tighten, not from fear but heartbreak. She looked down at Ethan, whose eyes were wide with tears. I'm sorry, Grace whispered, forcing a sad smile. It's okay, sweetheart. I'm just glad your dad's alive. Ethan ran forward and hugged her legs tightly. Please don't go, Mum. You're my hero. Grace knelt and hugged him back, her voice trembling. You're the real hero, Ethan. You saved him by never giving up. Then, before she could say another word, the guards gently guided her toward the exit. She didn't fight them. She just kept her head high, walking away with silent dignity as the sound of the storm faded behind her. In the hallway's reflection, Grace caught one last glimpse of herself, a tired, drenched woman disappearing into the shadows of a world that would never know her name. But Ethan did. And as she walked out into the night, his small voice echoed in her memory. Ma'am, please save my dad. She already had. The days after that night passed in a blur. The storm had cleared, the city had dried, and people had moved on, as they always did. But for Grace Miller, time seemed to move slower than ever. She woke up early as always before the sun rose, in her tiny one-bedroom apartment in the Bronx. The walls were thin, the heater old, and the paint was beginning to peel, but it was home. The kind of home that smelled faintly of coffee, soap and love. As she stood in the kitchen, pouring hot water over instant coffee, she caught sight of a small photo pinned to the refrigerator. A smiling boy in a school uniform, holding up a drawing. Her son, Caleb, age 9, her reason for everything. Morning, Mom, he mumbled sleepily, rubbing his eyes as he shuffled out of the small bedroom. Morning. Sweetheart, Grace replied softly, kissing his forehead. Breakfast is almost ready. As he sat down, chattering about school, Grace smiled and listened, but her mind drifted. She couldn't stop seeing another little boy's face. Ethan. Standing in the rain, crying for his father. The memory replayed in her mind like a haunting film. The thunder, the marble floor, the cold stare of the billionaire's wife. Grace stirred her coffee absent-mindedly. Do they even remember me? She tried to push the thought away, but it lingered. Not because she wanted money or praise, that's what she didn't. But the way Mrs. Hargrove had looked at her, like she was nothing, like her kindness was suspicious, had cut deep. At work, Grace went through her daily routine at St. Mary's Hospital. The fluorescent lights buzzed, the smell of antiseptic filled the halls, and the constant beeping of machines was the rhythm of her world. She moved from patient to patient with calm hands and a warm smile. The elderly woman in room 203 called her Angel. The young man in room 108 said she reminded him of his mother. Grace smiled at them all. She cared deeply for every stranger she met, even when the world didn't care for her. But every night, when her shift ended and she walked the long road back home, her heart grew heavy. Does kindness even matter anymore? She wondered. Do people only value those who have money, fame, or power? One evening, while folding laundry, she turned on the old television sitting on her counter and froze. On the screen, a news anchor smiled brightly. In today's business headlines, billionaire real estate tycoon Richard Hargrove has made a full recovery after suffering a sudden cardiac arrest last week. Sources say he's resting at home with family after successful surgery. Grace put the shirt in her hands down slowly. There he was, the same man she had fought to save. He looked strong again, clean-shaven, dressed in a designer suit. Cameras flashed as he smiled and waved while entering his mansion. The reporter continued. Hargrove's staff credits quick medical response and world-class care at St. Matthew's for his recovery. No mention of her. Not even a word. Grace's throat tightened. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "World-class care, huh?" and smiled sadly. She didn't need fame. She didn't want a reward. But a simple thank you, even whispered through a letter, would have been enough. Still, she turned off the TV, folded the rest of her laundry, and kept going. Because that was who she was, a woman who didn't do good for attention but because it was right. Later that night, Caleb noticed her quietness. "Mom, are you okay?" Grace smiled faintly. "Yeah, baby. Just tired," he frowned. "You always help people, Mom, but who helps you?" The question struck her harder than anything else that day. She hugged him tightly. "You do, sweetheart. You help me just by being you." As he drifted off to sleep, Grace sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. Somewhere out there, beyond those towers of glass, lived the people whose lives she had touched for only a moment, people who would never know her name, never remember her face. And yet, deep down, Grace didn't regret a thing. Because in her heart, she knew, and true kindness doesn't need recognition. It leaves its mark in ways the world may never see. Still, sometimes, she caught herself glancing at her phone, hoping for a call that never came. A message, a sign, something, but nothing came. Until one quiet evening, a knock at the door. It was soft at first, almost hesitant. Grace frowned and wiped her hands on a towel. Visitors were rare in her life. She opened the door carefully. And there, standing on her doorstep, was a familiar face, small, bright, full of hope. "Ethan," she whispered, her heart skipping a beat. He stood there holding a bouquet of white lilies, rain-damp, slightly crooked but beautiful, and behind him, a tall figure she recognized instantly, Richard Hargrove himself. Grace's breath caught. For the first time since that stormy night, her world began to change. The soft knock echoed again. Grace's heart thudded in her chest as she opened the door wider. Uncertain of what she was seeing, standing before her was Ethan, the billionaire's young son, the same boy whose cries had broken her heart that night in the rain. He held a small bouquet of white lilies, petals trembling in the evening breeze. Behind him stood Richard Hargrove, tall but frail-looking, his eyes gentler than she remembered. For a moment no one spoke. The world outside seemed to quiet itself. The distant traffic, the hum of the city, even the flicker of the hallway light. Everything stilled. Then Ethan stepped forward. "Ma'am." His voice was small but steady. "Please save my dad." Grace blinked, confusion flashing across her face. "Sweetheart, your dad's right here. He's okay now." Ethan shook his head quickly, clutching the flowers tighter. "No, I mean—" "Save him again," he said. "He doesn't smile anymore. He says he owes you his life, but he doesn't know how to say thank you." Grace's heart softened instantly. She knelt to meet Ethan's eyes. "Oh, honey, you already said thank you, the night you cried for him." "That was enough for me." Behind him, Richard cleared his throat, his deep voice quieter than she expected. "Grace Miller," he said, his tone filled with something new, something she hadn't heard before, respect. "I had to find you. I didn't even know your name until my assistant tracked down the nurse from that night. I owe you everything." Grace straightened, her hands nervously fidgeting with her apron. "Sir, you don't owe me anything. I was just doing what anyone would do." He gave a small, tired smile. "You and I both know that's not true. I've lived in a world where most people walk past pain, where money buys silence. But you stopped in the storm." Ethan looked up at his father proudly. "Dad said you're the reason I still have him. So we came to say thank you, properly this time." Grace's eyes glistened as she accepted the flowers. Their stems were unevenly cut, the petals slightly crushed, but to her, they were more beautiful than any expensive bouquet could ever be. "Thank you, Ethan," she whispered, brushing a tear away. Richard glanced around her modest apartment, the flickering bulb, the thin curtains, the worn couch. It was a far cry from the mansion he lived in, but it radiated warmth, something his house never had. "May I come in?" he asked softly. Grace hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Of course." He stepped inside carefully, looking almost out of place among the humble surroundings. Yet something in his expression shifted, or maybe even shame. "This place," he said quietly, "feels more like a home than mine ever did." Grace offered a small smile. "That's because home isn't built from money. It's built from love." Ethan wandered over to a small shelf filled with Caleb's drawings, colorful scribbles of hearts, stick figures, and smiling suns. "Did your son make these?" he asked. Grace nodded proudly. "Yes, his name's Caleb. He's at school right now." "They're amazing," Ethan said. "He's really good." Richard's gaze softened as he looked at the drawings too. "You're raising a kind boy. You can see it in his art." Grace's voice caught. "I'm trying my best." Richard turned to her then, emotion shining in his eyes. "Grace, when I woke up in that hospital bed, I didn't remember much. But my son told me everything. How you didn't hesitate, how you saved me while my own guards froze. I realized I'd spent my life surrounded by people who worked for me. Not with me. You reminded me what humanity looks like." Grace blinked back tears. "You don't have to say that." He stepped closer. "I do because I want to change, Grace, for my son. For myself. And maybe because of you." For a moment, the air between them was still. There was no billionaire, no nurse, no class divide. Only two people connected by one act of courage. Ethan tugged at Grace's sleeve, smiling shyly. "My dad says he wants to do something nice for you. Anything you want." Grace laughed softly. "Sweetheart, your dad already gave me something nice when seeing you both happy." But Richard shook his head. "No, Grace, please, let me do something. A foundation, a scholarship for your son. Something lasting. Not charity, gratitude." Grace hesitated, tears glimmering in her eyes. "All right," she whispered finally. "If you really want to thank me, then use your power to help more people, the ones no one sees. Help them the way you helped yourself tonight." Richard nodded slowly, deeply moved. "I will. I promise." For the first time since that stormy night, he smiled, a real unguarded smile. Ethan beamed beside him, and Grace felt something lift from her heart. The weight of being unseen, forgotten small. As the father and son left, the lilies still in her hand, Grace stood at the doorway, the evening light spilling across her face. For once, the world didn't feel so divided. It felt human, and for Grace Miller that was more than enough. The next morning, Richard Hargrove stood before the tall glass windows of his office, the skyline of New York stretching endlessly before him. He'd stood here 1,000 times before, but today, everything looked different. For years, all he'd seen were numbers, profit margins, stock tickers, contracts, and deals. But now, as sunlight spilled across the city, he saw something else, people. People walking to work. A man handing his daughter a lunchbox, a woman carrying groceries through the wind. Lives he had never noticed before. Grace's words echoed in his mind. "If you really want to thank me, help the ones no one sees." He took a deep breath. For the first time in decades, his heart felt awake. Later that afternoon, he called an emergency board meeting. His executives arrived, polished, powerful, and impatient, wondering why the billionaire was suddenly breaking his strict schedule. Richard looked around the room, eyes steady. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice strong yet calm, "we've spent years building towers that touch the sky. Now it's time to build something that touches hearts." They exchanged confused glances. One of them cleared his throat. "Sir, if this is about the new luxury project—" "It's not," Richard interrupted. "It's about something more important. We're launching a new foundation, the Grace Initiative. It'll provide free medical support for underprivileged families, scholarships for nurses, and emergency care access in poor neighborhoods." Silence filled the room. "Sir, with respect," another executive said, "that's a massive financial shift. Our investors might—" "I'm not asking," Richard said firmly. "I'm telling you, this isn't charity, it's redemption." For the first time, they saw not the ruthless billionaire, but a man who had been broken and rebuilt. Over the next few weeks, the news spread like wildfire. Headlines filled social media. Billionaire Richard Hargrove launches. Humanitarian Foundation names it after a hospital nurse. From fortune to faith, a tycoon's act of gratitude. When Grace first saw her name flash across the screen, she nearly dropped her coffee mug. "The Grace Initiative?" she whispered. He really did it. Her phone started buzzing non-stop, calls from journalists, co-workers, and even the hospital director. But amidst the noise, Grace stayed humble. She didn't seek the spotlight. Her only wish was that the help reached those who truly needed it. Days later, she received a formal invitation, handwritten, elegant, and sealed with gold. "You changed my life. Now I want to honor yours. Please join us at the launch ceremony of the Grace Initiative. Richard Hargrove." Grace hesitated. She wasn't used to grand events or luxury halls. She didn't even own a proper dress. But Caleb, her son, was beyond excited. "Mom, you have to go. He's naming it after you." Grace smiled softly. "I guess I can't say no now, can I?" The night of the ceremony arrived. Grace wore a simple navy dress, her hair tied neatly, her son proudly holding her hand. They entered a ballroom glittering with chandeliers and cameras flashing from every corner. When Richard saw her walk in, he stood from the stage immediately, his expression filled with pride and warmth. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced into the microphone, "the woman who taught me what true wealth means, Grace Miller." The audience turned as Grace walked shyly toward him, unsure where to look. Applause filled the room, echoing off the golden walls. Richard continued, "When I lay dying, I thought money could save me. But it was her, a nurse with no riches, no fame, and no reason to stop, who saved my life. Today I return that gift by helping thousands more in her name." Tears welled in Grace's eyes. She hadn't expected this. She never wanted fame, but seeing the ripple of goodness her small act had created filled her heart with quiet pride. Then Ethan came on stage, grinning brightly. "This is for you, Miss Grace," he said, holding out a small gold pin in the shape of a heart. "Dad said heroes should wear this." Grace knelt to accept it, her hands trembling. "Thank you, Ethan. You've got a big heart, just like your father." The crowd erupted in applause again, some wiping tears. Even the coldest investors looked moved. For the first time, Grace stood in a room full of the powerful, not as someone unseen, but as someone respected. As the night went on, reporters asked her questions. Photographers took pictures. But all she said was simple. "You don't need to be rich to make a difference. You just need to care." That quote went viral within hours. People across the country shared it with the hashtag #GraceInitiative, turning her words into a movement. By morning, applications poured in for nurse scholarships, free clinic partnerships, and community health drives. Grace's kindness had started something unstoppable, and as Richard watched her speak to the crowd with humility and strength, he whispered to himself, "You saved me twice, Grace. Once from death, and once from myself." Weeks passed since that unforgettable night at the gala, but for Grace Miller, life had not returned to normal. It had transformed. Everywhere she went, people recognized her. In the hospital corridors, patients smiled a little brighter. Nurses whispered her name with pride. Even the janitor, Mr. Reed, who had worked silently for 20 years, patted her shoulder one morning and said softly, "You remind us why we're here." Grace. The Grace Initiative had exploded into something far greater than anyone imagined. Clinics began opening in poor neighborhoods. Ambulances painted with the logo, a small golden heart, rolled through the city streets, helping people who could never afford treatment before. And behind it all, Grace stayed quietly in the background, still wearing her nurse's uniform, still showing up for work every day. When reporters tried to praise her as a modern hero, she simply said, "I'm no hero. I just did what my heart told me to do." But deep down, she was proud, not of fame, but of the lives being changed. One afternoon, as she was finishing her shift, a familiar figure appeared at the hospital lobby. Richard Hargrove, holding a small box. His face looked healthier, his eyes softer, his posture lighter. "Grace," he greeted warmly, "I have something for you." She smiled in surprise. "Mr. Hargrove, I told you, you don't need to." "I know," he interrupted gently, "but this isn't repayment. It's respect." He handed her the box. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a golden badge engraved with her name, Grace Miller, founder of the Grace Initiative. Her eyes shimmered. "I didn't have to do this," Richard smiled. "You changed my son's life. You changed mine, and now you're changing the world. The least I can do is make sure everyone remembers who started it." Grace looked up, her eyes soft with emotion. "If I've changed anything, it's because I believed people could still care. Even when the world said they didn't." He nodded slowly. "And because of you, I care now too." Before he left, Richard glanced at her and said, "Your son, how is he doing?" Grace's face brightened instantly. "Caleb, he's doing great. Loves school. Loves drawing. Says he wants to be a doctor one day, like the ones he sees on TV." Richard smiled knowingly. "Then let's make that happen." Grace frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" He grinned. "I want the Grace Initiative to give its first full scholarship to Caleb Miller so he can study medicine when he grows up. He deserves that chance." Grace's hand flew to her mouth as tears welled in her eyes. "Oh, Richard, I can't." "Yes, you can," he said firmly, "because you gave me a second chance at life. It's only right I help give your son his first." In that moment, Grace couldn't speak. Her tears fell freely as she hugged him, something she never thought she'd do. It wasn't about wealth or status anymore. It was about humanity. That evening, as Grace walked home holding the small box and her heart full of gratitude, she found Caleb sitting on the steps, sketching something in his notebook. "What are you drawing, sweetheart?" she asked. He grinned and turned the book around. On the page was a picture of two people, one in a nurse's uniform and one in a suit, standing side by side under a heart that said, "The Grace Initiative." Grace gasped softly. "That's beautiful, baby." Caleb smiled proudly. "That's you and Mr. Hargrove, Mom. You're helping people together." She ruffled his hair gently, whispering, "Maybe we are." As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and violet, Grace looked out over the city. She thought about the night of the storm, the fear, the crying boy, the powerful woman who had looked down on her. And she thought about now, how everything had changed because she refused to walk away when someone needed help. Sometimes, she realized the smallest acts of courage ripple out farther than we ever see. Months later, the news reported that the Grace Initiative had opened its first free hospital wing. On its marble wall, engraved in silver letters, were the words, "In honor of those who give without asking and heal without judgment." And below that, her name. Grace stood before that wall one quiet evening, tears glimmering in her eyes. Ethan was there too, holding her hand, his father standing proudly beside them. Ethan looked up at her and said, "Miss Grace, you saved my dad that night. But now that you've saved so many more," Grace smiled softly, her voice trembling. "No, Ethan, we did together." As they stood in that shining new hospital, laughter and light echoing in the halls, Grace felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. She didn't have millions. She didn't have luxury, but she had something far greater, a legacy of kindness that would live on long after she was gone. And somewhere deep in her heart, she whispered a quiet prayer of thanks for the night that began in storm and ended in grace. Sometimes, the richest people aren't those with money, but those who give from the heart. Grace Miller didn't just save a life, she changed one. And in doing so, she reminded the world that compassion is the greatest wealth of all.